This is the true story of Chris Gardner, titled The Pursuit of Happyness. The film opens with Chris letting us know that the first time he met his father was when he was 28 years old, and he made up his mind that any kids he has are going to know who their father is. He is a man with high standards and ambitions, and is annoyed that his son's daycare center spells the word happiness incorrectly as happiness with a Y. It's San Francisco in 1981, and Gardner is carrying a machine with him while riding the bus. This machine is a bone density scanner, which is a medical device he sells for a living. It gives a slightly denser picture than an X-ray, but costs twice the money. Needless to say, this wasn't selling very well. He needed to sell at least 2 scanners a month to pay for rent and daycare. He hasn't sold any for a while and has no idea what to do. Chris lives with his wife Linda and son Chris Jr. He is unable to pay his bills and is getting further into debt, much to the annoyance of Linda. The next day, Chris is walking to work and notices a flashy sports car. He smiles at the driver walking out and says, "I've got 2 questions for you. What do you do, and how do you do it?" The guy laughs and explains that he is a stockbroker. Chris concedes that you probably need to go to college to be a stockbroker. The man explains that you don't have to. You just need to be good with numbers and good with people. Chris looks at these stockbrokers coming out of the building and remarks on how happy they all look. He decides to look into becoming a stockbroker, and his wife laughs it off. She's been pulling double shifts for months now, and they will soon be 3 months behind on rent. Chris now has a meeting at a corporate building about a potential stockbroking job, but he is still carrying his bone density scanner. He sees a lady busking with a guitar on the street and offers her money to look after it for him. He feels like he would look unprofessional carrying the scanner with him into the building. He is sitting at the interview, and he can see out the window that the busker has run away with the scanner. He quickly leaves the interview and chases after her, but she gets away on a train. The program Chris had applied for takes just 20 people every 6 months. Given that he had no college education, and hundreds of other candidates probably did, Chris was unlikely to get this job. Chris now has an interview with a company called Dean Winter Reynolds, and this time brings the scanner with him. Chris ambushes its head of resources, Jay Twistle, and wants to talk to him about his application, but Jay makes an excuse to not speak with him. Chris then sees the busker who stole his scanner and chases after her. Chris explains how much these machines mean to him. We cut to a flashback of Chris buying carloads of these machines. He essentially spent his life savings on these machines. He thought that they were groundbreaking technology, but didn't know that doctors would consider them unnecessary luxuries. So if he loses one of these machines, it's like losing a month's groceries. He finally catches up with the busker. She is too afraid to say anything, and he just grabs it back. Chris chases after Jay Twistle again, and this time Jay is unable to get rid of him. Chris lies that he is going in the same direction as him and suggests that they should share a cab. During the car ride, Jay is doing a Rubik's Cube and is unable to do it. Chris explains that he can do it, and Twistle doesn't believe him. Chris solves the cube in a matter of minutes, and really impresses Jay. Even the taxi driver is incredibly impressed, but he leaves the taxi and Chris has to pay the fare for the taxi. Chris does not have enough money, so is left with no other option than to run out of the car. He then goes to a payphone to ring his wife. She explains that she is leaving him and taking their son with her. He finds the house empty when he gets home. The phone rings, and it's Jay. He wants him to call in the day after tomorrow in the morning to discuss the internship. He then finds his wife on her way to work and confronts her for taking his son away from him. She tells him that she's not happy, and Chris tells her that the boy is staying with him. He picks him up from daycare that afternoon. That evening, a loud knock is heard on the door. It's the landlord, and he is asking for rent money. They are 3 months behind on rent, and the landlord wants him out tomorrow as he has painters coming in. The landlord gives him another week and wants Chris to paint the apartment. The next morning, we see Chris painting the apartment. He is wearing old clothes and has bits of paint all over himself, including his hair. Another knock on the door is heard, and it's the police. He has some unpaid parking tickets and needs to go to the police station right away. At the station, he hands one of the officers a check. The problem is, the check won't clear until tomorrow, so he needs to stay in jail until tomorrow morning when the check clears. This means nobody can look after his son, and he could miss his interview tomorrow. Chris calls Linda, who agrees to look after him. Chris gets out of prison the next morning, but it's too late to get back home. He's wearing paint gear with bits of paint stuck in his hair, but he decides to go to the job interview anyway. He gets some dirty looks from people in the office, and even dirtier ones from the panel of people interviewing him, which includes Jay Twistle. He tells them that he was unable to come up with an excuse and just tells them the truth. He was arrested for not paying parking tickets. Jay has spoken highly of him and how determined he is to get the job. Nonetheless, the head of the panel, Mr. Frome, is less than impressed. Mr. Frome asks Chris, "What would you say if a guy walked into an interview without a shirt on and I hired him?" Chris responds, "He must have had on some really nice pants." They all burst out laughing, including Mr. Frome. Chris may have just charmed his way out of this seemingly impossible situation. Jay congratulates him outside, and Chris says he'll let him know if he can do it. Chris has only recently found out that an internship means no salary, and someone in his position cannot go 6 months without any income. He has until tonight to decide. The only money he could make in the next 6 months would be his 6 scanners, which he could still try to sell. His wife explains that there's a job opening for her in New York, and she is moving there soon. Chris explains that Chris Jr. is staying with him. He explains that she knows that she can't take care of him. His wife bids a tearful goodbye. Chris calls Jay to inform him that he is accepting the internship. Chris has now moved across the street to a cheaper accommodation. It's Saturday, so they play basketball together. Chris Jr. says that he wants to play professionally, but Chris tells him that it's highly unlikely that he will make it as a professional. Chris Jr. is downhearted by this information and puts his ball away. Chris then tells Chris Jr. that he should never let anybody tell him that he can't do something, even him. He then sells one of his scanners at a discounted price to one of the doctors who previously rejected him. He begins his first day at the internship and has explained that he will essentially be cold calling employees from Fortune 500 companies. They are handed phone books of prospective clients, and whoever rakes in the most sales wins a job at the company. Chris is given a 10-minute break when he spots someone in the crowd. In the distance is a person holding one of his machines. He chases after him. He begins running through the crowds and then crosses the road. Suddenly, he is hit by a car. He seems okay, but he cannot find his shoe. Despite being hit by a car and losing one of his shoes, he returns to work. Work is becoming pretty tough for Chris. He is now a single father and now needs to leave the office earlier than his other colleagues in order to pick up his son from daycare. He needs to get the same amount of work his peers do in 9 hours in the space of 6 hours. He literally doesn't even hang up the phone all day. But even doing that, he still doesn't manage to get through all of his potential clients. He decides to take a shortcut. He has the list of employees at a pension fund, and instead of working his way from the bottom, he cold calls the CEO of the company. As luck would have it, the CEO, Mr. Ribbon, had a canceled meeting and is suddenly free. He will meet with him if he can be there in 20 minutes. He rushes out the door, but his internship boss, Mr. Frackish, asks him to move his car. He tries to quickly move the car but gets stuck in traffic. He arrives at the meeting, but it's too late. Mr. Ribbon has left. The secretary tells him that he has just missed him. Chris decides to pursue this client even further. He and his son travel to Mr. Ribbon's house. He calls to his door and apologizes for missing the meeting. Mr. Ribbon tells him not to worry about it, and they agree to reschedule. He even brings them to Candlestick Park. They go to the game, but later on Mr. Ribbon makes it clear that he probably won't be interested in his opportunity. 4 months later, Chris had sold all of his remaining scanners. It seems like he was finally making it, until he receives a letter from the IRS. He hasn't been paying his taxes, so the IRS sent him a letter notifying him that they will be seizing $600 from him. He now only has $21.33 in his bank account. He was dead broke. The next day, they are at the playground. Chris spots someone with one of his machines and chases after him. The guy who has it is on drugs and thinks it's a time machine. He tries to sell the machine again, but it's no longer working. The doctor sees how desperate he is and agrees to buy it once it's fixed. He comes home later that evening to find out that all of their things have been put outside the house. His keys no longer work. He's been evicted without notice. They end up spending the night sitting on a bench at the train station. He makes it seem more exciting for Chris Jr. by playing games with him. They pretend the scanner is an actual time machine. They eventually sleep in one of the bathrooms. Security eventually tries to break in. Chris has to lie to Chris Jr. and tell him that it's all a game that they're playing. We see tears stream down Chris's eyes when he has to pray that they don't break the door. Chris eventually tries to stay at some homeless shelters. One of them only takes in women and children, but Chris doesn't want Chris Jr. staying on his own. They try another across town. A staff member comes out and tells everyone in the line that they only have 4 spots left. Chris is 4th in the queue, but is skipped by another person. Chris tells him to move, but he won't budge. A scuffle breaks out between the two, but is soon broken up. A bystander tells the staff member that the other person skipped in front of him. They got a room. While Chris Jr. is asleep, Chris spends the night trying to fix the scanner. Living at this shelter means that Chris has to come home even earlier from work, as they close at 5. He also needs to bring all of his clothes with him in a suitcase to work. When people ask, he just tells them that he's going on a work trip. We then move to the final exam for the internship. Chris finishes much faster than everyone else and leaves the room. When speaking to another intern on the elevator, we realize that he had to leave early during this exam, but finished every question. Outside the building, Mr. Frome emerges from a cab. He tells Chris that he left his wallet upstairs and needs $5. Chris offers to get his wallet for him, but his boss has no time to wait. Chris gives him the $5, despite how much he needs it. Later that day, they didn't get a spot at the shelter. All of the rooms were full. We later see Chris giving blood for money. He then uses that money to pay for parts to fix the machine. They then stay at another hostel with a room shared by many other people. Chris Jr. asks his dad if his mom left because of him. Chris reassures him that he had nothing to do with it. Chris then spends the night fixing that machine. The next morning, he sells it for $250 and gets some much-needed cash. They can even afford to stay at a hotel that night. Chris has one more day of the internship. Jay tells him that whatever happens, he's done a fantastic job. Mr. Frackish then invites Chris into a room to meet with the rest of the panel. Chris is told to sit down. Chris tries to break the tension and says, "I thought I'd wear a shirt today, seeing as it's my last day." Mr. Frome tells him to wear one tomorrow. Chris has got the job. He is almost in tears of happiness. He holds himself together, shakes their hands, and leaves. We see a jubilated Chris walking through the street. He picks up Chris Jr. and lifts him into his arms. We are then told that after his career at Dean Witter, Chris went on to found the investment firm Gardner Rich in 1987. We end with Chris and Chris Jr. walking hand in hand as Chris Jr. tells knock-knock jokes. We are then told that Chris sold a minority stake in his firm in 2006, a deal which made him a millionaire. He was officially rich.